Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our podcast of a recording with Sir Ranulph Fiennes' old Sandroydian, which was recorded earlier this week. And I started by chatting to Sir Ranulph about his time at Sandroyd, and I managed to find in the old Sandroydian his entry from the headmaster at the time when he left to go on to Eton, and it reads as follows. Ranulph Fiennes goes on to Eton, where it's suggested he will soon be leading a gang. Be that as it may, he will certainly make his mark as he has made it here. The combination of his histrionic ability, imagination, humour and leadership could hardly fail to attract attention. No doubt his talent for telling ghost and other stories will also come in use. It also has an entry for him for the first 11 football, which reads as follows. Sir Ranulph Fiennes spoils much of his real usefulness by hanging back, but showed real ability from time to time. And I think anyone who has read about or who knows Sir Ranulph will agree that there's certainly been no hanging back, and he has definitely shown his real ability in his career as an explorer. So we had a few technical issues when we were talking on the telephone. I ended up having to shout an awful lot so he could hear me from where he was, but I think we've managed to edit the recording so it all works, and I'm delighted that so many children from Sandroyd asked Sir Ranulph a question, and we will start with our first question.
Hello, Sir Ranulph. What was your best memory from Sandroyd?
I think the very best memory is when our little gang discovered Pitt River's cave and found that being in the Sandroyd Wolf Cubs, sort of minor Boy Scouts, we were able and allowed by the master, who's called, I think, Percy Jones, to wander around in that area of the Sandroyd Woods, not terribly far from the football ground, cricket ground, and we discovered, or that's the word we used, this secret cave with a snake in it, maybe more than one snake, but we saw one snake. So we claimed the cave and the quarry in which it was, and we all signed in blood, the members of the gang, and we said, what will we call the gang? And someone had learnt in Latin the word spelunca, which means cave in Latin, and so we thought we'd call ourselves the Spelunca Gang. But the guy called William Hillary, who was a member of the gang, later became very important in the parental organisation of Sandroyd, and his children been there too. And William decided that it'd be much more clever to call it the Acnuleps Gang. Spell Spelunca backwards, and that will confuse the teachers. And no, we were very, very happy there. We had gang meetings down there and organised little wood fights with sticks against the Leslie gang. That was another little gang. But Mr. Ozanne and later Mr. Buckland, both of whom I was deservedly beaten by for misbehaviour, didn't like me starting gangs in lovely Sandroyd, which I now fully appreciate. But having been brought up in South Africa, where at 4 schools there were things called gangs, nowadays the word gang has got a bad feeling to it, but not then. It was like a club, and those were the happy days.
Hello, Sir Ranulph. What was the naughtiest thing you did at Sandroyd?
The naughtiest thing, I think, was that I was in a dormitory. Oh dear, I had the name of the dormitory on the tip of my tongue. It doesn't matter. There were about 6 of us in that dormitory, and for some reason I was head of it one term, and one of the duties when there was a fire alarm was to put each boy, clip him in carefully to the harness, and then let the rope out so that he could descend from the window of the dormitory something like Smith or something like that. Down, I think, 3 floors to the safety of the ground below during the fire alarm exercise. And there was a chap called Percy Davis who was in the other gang, and I didn't like him at all. And he happened to be in that dormitory. So when I clipped him on, I didn't put the safety clip across, hoping that he would fall out, and that would be a sensible way of dealing with him. Unfortunately, he discovered it and pointed it out to Sister, that's the nurse, and I was in trouble and got badly beaten, quite rightly.
Health and safety at its finest.
What's the one key thing that you took away from Sandroyd to help you in your later life?
Well, apart from losing my South African accent, with help from a wonderful South African teacher at Sandroyd called Mr. Barnard, Jeffrey Barnard, and apart from losing that accent, which was important because going on to Eton after Sandroyd, it's best not to be teased because of having a funny accent. So I learned to speak proper English at Sandroyd, and found the A sound was the most difficult to get rid of. But me and all my sisters who'd been at schools out there as well also had to learn to speak properly before they went on to their schools. And I think that was a pretty important thing to learn.
Tom Hadfield, Year 3. When you were young, much of the world was unexplored. I want to be an explorer when I grow up, but it seems like there's not much left to explore. Where should I focus?
Well, we realised that if you are making a profession almost out of exploring or out of expeditions, because exploring means going where nobody has been before. And I was very lucky because in 1984, the Guinness Book of Records had a thing called the World Hall of Fame, and a record for music was given on the basis of the greatest number of millions of records sold to Paul McCartney, so he was called the world's greatest living musician. There was a sports lady called Billie Jean King who became the world's greatest living sportswoman, and that's sort of how they did it. And I, at the time, had the greatest number of records for real exploration, which wasn't difficult because we, my team and myself, we both, not both, all 3 of us, completed the first journey around planet Earth vertically. People had been around the world horizontally, but not from north to south or south to north, going through both poles, crossing both the Antarctica, which is bigger than America, but just snow and ice, and goes up to 11,000 feet above sea level, and also the whole of the Arctic, which, unlike Antarctica, which is a continent of land with ice on top of it, the Arctic Ocean is just an ocean with thin ice moving around all the time on the top of it, including over the pole itself. And to get up there, you have to go through 3,000 miles of the Northwest Passage in the icy seas of North America, which is in a way more difficult even than the 2 ice caps. And lots of that had never been explored before, and because there were in those days no polar orbiting satellites, there was also no GPS or sat-nav or sat-phone, so we were navigating in the same way as 50 or 60 years earlier people like Scott and Shackleton and Amundsen had done. No improvement on that. We were using the very basic method and still suffering from the same temperatures, of course. And the food that you carry doesn't become any better because you have to worry about maximum calories for minimum weight because you're towing it all for thousands of miles. So we passed through areas which had never been explored before by any human being and never flown over, and made the very first maps of it. And my wife, who was the nerve center of the expedition, in the polar base with Morse code radio. She was awarded the very first polar medal by the Queen for all the scientific work she did about the ionosphere when she was in the Antarctic base hut in the middle of nowhere for 8 months.
If you got scared on your expeditions, what would you do?
I believe you suffered from vertigo when you climbed Everest. What is your advice for conquering your fears?
Well, I sort of got born with two phobias. In South Africa, when I was about 6 years old, before I went to school, I used to go to Mummy's room and draw her curtains and say goodbye. And one morning, a big South African spider dropped down the back of my pajamas, and I developed a phobia against spiders for many, many years until I joined the Arab army fighting communists in the 1960s, where there were lots and lots of spiders, and they taught me not to be frightened of them. But I had another phobia, which I still have, which is heights. And when my wife of 34 years died, which was 16 years ago now, I was so desolate that I did nothing for a year, and I had to snap out of it. So I thought I'd try to face what really was meaningful, which was a vertigo phobia. And I thought, well, might as well try Everest. And on the third go, age 65, I managed to get up Everest as the oldest Brit. But I came away from Everest without having seen a single drop. Because on Everest, when you look down on the normal routes, you see a sort of white shoulder going downhill, but not a proper drop, a black cliff face drop, which is what brings on vertigo. And my guide said, well, if Everest hasn't cured you, I'll take you to one much nearer Britain called the north face of the Eiger in the Alps, and that will definitely cure you. And 54 top climbers in the previous century trying to be first had fallen off or been knocked off by falling rock. And I managed to get up. It took 3 days and nights to climb up this 6,000-foot rock face. But on getting to the top with my two guides, the main guide, Kenton Cool, who's been up Everest 14 times, said, I take it, Ran, that now you've been to the top of the north face of the Eiger, you no longer have vertigo. And I found to my horror that although that was true when I was with him and the other guide, they had an effect that as soon as I was on any sort of drop without them, the vertigo came rushing back. And that, I think, was my most fearful moments on realizing that I was on a rock face and suddenly I had vertigo because those two people weren't with me.
How do you deal with those moments of doubt when you're not sure that you're going to make it, you're not sure you're going to achieve something that you set out to do?
Well, I basically imagine that the two people I respect most, my dad and my granddad, my dad was killed in the war 4 months before I was born, so I didn't meet him or my granddad. But Mum, growing up in South Africa, told me stories about both of them. And so I imagined in circumstances like you're talking about, when everything is getting really, really bad and you think you're going to give up, which you mustn't do as leader, I then think to myself, Dad and Granddad are watching me and I do not want to be the first to give up. But of course, if someone else gives up, then that's their fault. So you're rather in the tent every night, completely exhausted, frostbite and everything else like that. You're thinking of giving it up. You don't. You look around hoping that one of the others will give up.
Hello, sir. Thank you for your time. Which expeditions would you do again, and what would you change the next time round? Thank you.
Well, one of the expeditions, which my wife and I, well, actually, to begin with, not my wife, just me, on leave from the army in Arabia, a Bedou guide had told me of a fabulous lost city, the main city for selling frankincense to the Roman Empire. on the other side of 1,000 miles of desert. So that frankincense had to be carried from South Arabia up to Jerusalem, maybe 900 miles without water. And on the very edge of southern Arabia, or Dhofar as the place is called, was, according to Marco Polo's notes, a lost frankincense city. And it was fabulous. And the guide said he didn't know where it was exactly, but he knew that it had definitely been somewhere in the Nejd, that's the gravel deserts, and the bottom of the great sand dunes. So from 1968 onwards till we found the city in 92, that's 20-something years, we did 8 big expeditions to look for that lost city. And if we know now what we should have to have looked for it, it wouldn't have taken us 8 times over 26 years. It was a wonderful expedition, and in the long run, it paid off. We found it. It's called Atlantis of the Sands, or Ubar. I wrote a book about it. And that was very satisfactory, of course, when we eventually found it, although we wished we'd learnt a quicker way of doing so.
Hello, my name is Enna, and I want to ask you, what is the hardest expedition that you've ever done? Thank you.
Well, yeah, that was an attempt to do the first crossing with no support of the whole of the Antarctic continent. Now, Shackleton had planned to do that on his ship was called the Endurance, where he had 2 ships because he had 2 expedition teams which set out from different ends of Antarctica. One lot had to drop off food depots on their side so that when Shackleton's main group of 4 with dogs, if they managed to come across from the other side, if they managed to get all the way over the unexplored area to the South Pole and were still alive, and if they from there managed to come all the way down a great glacier, 10,000 foot down to sea level, to get to the Ross ice shelf below Australia, they would definitely have run out of food. So that's why the second team had dropped off food depots. And we were very sad, we being our polar British group 50, 60 years later, and I'm talking now about the 1990s, we decided to prove that if Shackleton's ship had not sunk and stopped him setting out, which is what happened, critics say that his plan, he never would have succeeded. So if the ship hadn't sunk and he had been dropped off with his team to do the crossing, he would have died en route. Well, we in 92 proved that no, even without dogs, because he had dogs which he could use to help pull all the stuff, and which when they got weak could be killed and eaten to help with the food crisis, which no doubt would happen. When we set out in 92, having been dropped off in exactly the same place where he would have started, and our team had no dogs, but there were 2 of us, and we'd travelled on Arctic and Antarctic before, and we had become quite good at pulling 500-pound loads on long, long journeys and starving slowly. And Dr. Michael Stroud, who is the senior lecturer now at Southampton University in stress nutrition and other things like that, and basically he planned our rations for this 92 expedition. We made it to the pole. We were in a very bad way by the time we got there. And for the other half of the journey, to get down to where Shackleton's men had dropped off the depot at Mount Hope, we just made it. We crossed the continent, the first people to do it with no support, and did the extra 40 miles pretty much dead. I was skeletal, but we made it thanks to his incredibly clever nutritional plan, which meant we only had to tow 500 pounds each, and it was based on the fact that you get far more calories for less weight from fat than you do from protein or carbohydrate.
Wow, so the science saved you, if you like.
Yes, entirely. He had been, Dr. Stroud had been before that the director of the APRE, the Army Personnel Research Establishment at Farnborough.
Hello, Sir Ranulph. If you could take an animal with you on one of your adventures, what would it be? Thank you.
Hello, Sir Ranulph. Have you ever taken a dog on one of your expeditions? And if you have, what sort of dog was it? And was it a good idea?
Yes, I told you my wife Ginny was the base commander and radio operator and went the whole way around the world. And she would not go on that expedition if she could not take her dog. I wrote a book called Bossy the Polar Dog with photographs of him out at both poles. He, for instance, became in the Guinness Book the only dog ever to have peed on both poles. And he went everywhere with her. He had polar clothing and booties and goggles.
Sir Ranulph, thank you very much for giving up your time to do this podcast. I was there for the last lecture you gave at Sandroyd, and I remember a question that came up, which I'm sure will interest us all, as to how did it come about that you had to amputate your own fingers?
That I made a very, very bad mistake. And in extreme cold, you shouldn't make mistakes. I never take anybody on my polar expeditions if they previously had frostbite. The only exception being when, after I had got frostbite, I wasn't going to make an exception for myself, obviously. And that was in the feet and the hands, but only very, very badly on my left hand. And the amputations to all 5 fingers, or half of each finger, including half of the thumb, had to be amputated. And that was because I went on an Arctic Ocean North Pole solo expedition. We have learnt, Mike Stroud and I, you must never go by yourself or you're asking for trouble. In Antarctica, where there are crevasse holes covered by snow so that you don't see them and you fall in them, maybe 200 feet deep, it's a good way of dying, but very stupid. If you are going into territory where you suspect there are crevasses, always fix up a 100-foot rope to the other man or woman. And that will mean that when you fall into it, the other guy or girl will pull you out. Or if they fall in, you will fall over and become an anchor and then pull them out. Now, that's in the Arctic where you're talking about snow over mountains, whereas in the Arctic, you need the same policy. You're not falling into crevasses because you're on thin ice over the sea, but you do obviously sometimes make a mistake, think the ice will hold you, but it won't. And you fall in, and you've got skis on your feet, and you've got a rucksack as well as a sledge that you're pulling, so it's not very easy to get yourself out onto the ice. But if you're going into an area which might be dangerous like that, rope up like you do in Antarctica, and then with your skis on and all your heavy clothing and everything, the other guy will pull you out of the water, put the tent up, get the cooker going so you don't get frostbite. And if you're solo and in the dark and there's a full moon which is breaking up the ice because of the tide, then you're in big trouble and you shouldn't be doing it solo. The only reason on that occasion that I did do it solo, and I'd taken all the medical kit we normally take from Dr. Stroud, who briefed me on what to do if I got kidney stones or something. So I was solo only because that particular North Pole record, unsupported, had been done by our rivals, the Norwegians, but by 2 of them. To break that record, you needed to do it solo.
What did you do with your fingers once you chopped them off?
When I chopped my fingers off, and I only did that because £7,000 amputation fee, and the only expert in Britain on cutting off fingers, usually because someone's had them burnt, not frostbitten, because England doesn't get that cold often. And this guy refused, after the damage had been done in the Arctic, to do the amputation of the dead half finger ends. So you look at your hand, imagine the top 2 inches of all each 5 fingers is mummified and dead, but still fixed to the bottom live half of the fingers. And they aren't going to be chopped off for £7,000 worth of your insurance won't cover it unless it's done when the doctor says. So at home on Exmoor back then with my late wife Ginny, she said I was getting very irritable because each time by mistake I touched the dead ends, it was agony down where the dead bit hit the live nerves of 5 fingers. And as I was getting irritable, she said, well, why don't we cut them off in a sort of temporary way so they're not sticking out like that? And then when you have your proper amputations after 5 months, you won't have had all that time putting up with banging stuff. And I thought that was a good idea. She by then was into cattle, and her cows on the farm, when they have long hooves, with clippers she cuts them off. And if they bleed or hurt, she moves the clippers further away from the live bit. And that's what we did. We bought a Black & Decker workbench and a fret saw, and in my office cut them off. Ginny bought me cups of tea. The thumb took me 2 days basically to get through because of the big bone. We cut them off, but then watching the ends lying on my desk, I thought, well, I can't throw them away. I've had them for over 60 years sort of thing, or whatever it was. So I kept them, and one disappeared from the desk, I think a mouse probably, so I now keep them in a Kodak tin.
Hello, Sir Ranulph. Did you always want to be an explorer when you were at Sandroyd?
When I was at Sandroyd, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. From basically a child until I was 24, I only wanted to do one thing at all, which was to go to the Royal Scots Greys Regiment as an officer and work my way up to be commanding officer of that regiment, which my father had commanded when he was wounded 5 times. He commanded the regiment at the Battle of Alamein, which was turning point of the war, and also again when the army landed at the bottom of Italy in Salerno, but he was killed sadly when they were freeing Naples before the Battle of Monte Cassino, and I wanted to be commander of that same regiment. In his day, when he joined, it was horses. When he was there, they changed to tanks, but he didn't have to have A-levels before going to Sandhurst. To get colonel of the regiment, you must go to Sandhurst first. So I desperately, when I was at Sandroyd, knew that I must pass my A-levels. But what was so time-consuming and enjoyable was at Sandroyd basically the lovely gang warfare that we had going on. And I think I didn't spend enough time, and I only got 2 O-levels, couldn't go to Sandhurst, so I had to go to the other place, Mons Cadet School, which only gets you not a regular officer commission, but a temporary one for 3 years. But then you are allowed to sign on 5 years for a year at a time. That makes 8 years. So I thought, well, by the time I've done 8 years, I'll prove to them that I'm so excellent that even without A-levels, I could command commander of the regiment. But when the 8 years came to a close, I realized, I was 24 by then, that I was not going to be able to do that. Partly because from Sandroyd, if I had gone to Winchester, which is what all my family finds do, because it was founded by our ancestor, Winchester was, and they had a thing called Founder's Kin, so you could get there free of charge if you were Twistleton Wickham Fines. but only if you get a certain level of common entrance exam from Sandroyd. And because I couldn't get a high enough level for Winchester, I went to the only place where they would accept sort of Pitt people like me, which was Eton.
And you talk an awful lot about your father, which is lovely to hear about his inspiration for you. And he was clearly a great leader of men, and a very brave man. And do you feel that bravery and leadership are nurture or nature?
Alistair, you faded almost completely away.
So you talk about your father a great deal, which is lovely to hear, and his inspiration to you. Do you feel that his bravery and his leadership, do you think bravery and leadership are nature or nurture?
Bravery, is it nurture or nature? I personally think it's genetic. And, you're either born with a certain amount of bravery in the same way as a certain amount of intelligence, depending on, your genes.
Sir Ranulph, thank you very much indeed for your time. What was particularly remarkable is I'm not sure you could hear me brilliantly for much of that interview, so I'm very grateful indeed for your perseverance through this podcast. It's lovely to hear about your time at Sandroyd, about the fun you had, and the very many happy occasions you enjoyed at the school here, but also just as exciting to hear about your thrilling career as the world's greatest living explorer. And we are immensely grateful for the time you have given us in answering the children's questions today. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, thank you very much indeed.